Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined for a second time by Dr. Mattia Riccardi. He's assistant professor at the Faculty of Arts at the University of Porto. We've already done an interview. I will be leaving a link to it in the description box. It was about Nietzsche. And today we're going to talk about his recent book, Nietzsche's Philosophical Psychology. So, Dr. Riccardi, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to have you on again.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me again. And it's, of course, a pleasure for me to be here making a second interview. So, thank you.
Great. So, what is philosophical psychology and in what ways does it differ from scientific psychology?
Okay. Well, I think it's maybe not a very common label. Nietzsche wasn't a experimental psychologist. He wasn't really a psychologist in the conventional sense of the term, but he came up with a lot of ideas about human psychology and insisted to be also considered some sort of psychologist. So the idea is just to point out that it is a kind of view about human psychology which is not produced by a psychologist, let's say, in a conventional sense, not by someone who does experimental psychology. This science was being basically born by the time Nietzsche was writing his own books. He was a contemporary of Wilhelm Wundt, who is credited to being among the first, to build this new science. So it's basically a view of the human mind, of human psychology, more based on, let's say, a philosophical approach, based, let's say, in general on self-observation, maybe phenomenology. But in the case of Nietzsche, he also read really some kind of psychological literature that was available back then. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. But would you say that he was a naturalist in any way in his approach or not?
Well, I think most Nietzsche scholars agree that Nietzsche was in some sense a naturalist. Now, you have texts where he says that we should, translate man back to nature. It's not entirely clear what he means by that, but he was in some kind of naturalist. I think that's accepted by almost anybody. The point is how far this naturalism reaches, so to say. So is it really a complete naturalism? So people like Brian Leiter says it is. Other scholars are more modest in the way in which they interpret Nietzsche's naturalism, but at least we can say that he rejects everything which is supernatural. The more controversial point is how strict, how close, let's say, to empirical sciences he thinks philosophy should be. But that's not really something I write about in the book. I just assume that he is in some sense, maybe a robust sense, a naturalist.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So getting now into the meat, let's say, of Nietzsche's philosophical psychology, I guess we first have to go through some concepts. I'm not sure if some of them are, I know that some of them, at least nowadays, are not exclusive to Nietzsche, and I don't know if they even originated with him, but let's start with drives and affects. Okay, so could you explain each of them?
Yeah. So, well, first of all, they are the two kind of mental things, so to speak, that Nietzsche thinks are most important to the way we work psychologically. So that's why I bring them up. So first, drives. So drives is it's no longer a concept that is really theorized a lot about in contemporary psychology. Though it used to be, I don't know, the beginning of the 20th century. But So it's more or less a behavioral disposition, um, and but a behavioral disposition that has some kind of active or of urgent character. So it drives the agent to do certain things, to pursue certain goals. So it has this goal-oriented character also. And Nietzsche basically believes that what we are psychologically at the most basic level is just a bundle of drives. So we have all this goal-oriented behavioral and active dispositions. Affects, well, that's a more common psychological term. It's basically what we nowadays often call emotions. So that would be a paradigmatic case of an affective state. But I think that's the domain of the affective is broader than that of emotion. So pains, for instance, have an affective component. So every time we have states, so mental states with an aversion component, for instance, they would count, at least to Nietzsche's eyes, as affective. So it's a very pervasive feature of our conscious life, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. And what is the relationship between the both of them, between drives and affects?
Yeah, so Nietzsche isn't very clear about that. He mentions them as being really the most basic, let's say, constituents of human psychology. Sometimes only drive, sometimes only affect, sometimes both, and it's not really clear what's the relation. So what I suggest in my book is that drives are more basic in that they are some kind of stable disposition. Affects are more like episodic states. And my idea is that usually a drive is something that structures our affective life in a certain way. So I just make an example to make it easier to understand. So one drive could be the drive to protect your offspring. So this kind of drive is a stable behavioral disposition. So you do a lot of things to protect your offspring, not only we human beings, but also, of course, a lot of other animals. And this means that on several occasions you will have a certain kind of affective reaction because you have this drive. So, for instance, if you see, I don't know, your child going towards some kind of danger, you will feel fear. If you may feel preoccupied about your children, or you may feel happy or proud of them on very different occasions. And those are all affective states in a certain way, dependent on the very fact that you have this basic drive that you want to take care of your children. So that's an example of the way in which I think drives and affects interacts according to Nietzsche. So affects are basically caused by drives on several occasions. So my drive, I don't know, to take care of my children makes me feel fear when I see them going towards a danger.
Mm-hmm. But it's not necessarily the case that one of them is more basic or fundamental than the other, and I mean one of them derives from the other, right? Like, for example, affects deriving from drives or vice versa. I mean, or that's at least not clear, right?
Yeah. I don't think they are that drives are more basic in that sense. Though, you know, Nietzsche there are some places where it seems to think that they really most of our mental life and also our affective life may derive from some kind of basic drive-like thing. For instance, he says that at least once about the will to power. Say, okay, in origin we have this kind of drive, the will to power, and the rest is just a derivation of that, let's say, on a phylogenetical scale or something like that. So maybe he entertained that thought. This passage where he says that is also very hard to interpret. But so what I mean, so it's not really that, but rather that I think drives are explanatorily more basic. So if I want to know why a father or a mother, feel fear because they see the children going towards a danger, I can say, well, because they have this drive to, just take care of their children. So I think we can appeal to drives to make sense of certain patterns of affective responses to the environment. So in that sense, I think they are explanatory and basic. So Nietzsche sometimes seems to speculate that they are really basic in a more kind of metaphysical sense or just evolutionary term, but that's not really something I investigate in my book. I don't think he has really any worked out idea about that. Though we do find, as I said, this speculation in Beyond Good and Evil about this possibility. Everything mental deriving in some form from a basic drive, which he calls the will to power.
Mm-hmm. Since sometimes it seems that at least he relates us to other animals, do you know if he was aware of the theory of natural selection and that he accepted it?
Okay, that's a complicated question. So Nietzsche was surely aware of certain theories about about evolution. He was aware of Darwinian natural selection theory, though in an indirect and not really very helpful way. So he relied a lot of German literature about that, which wasn't always, I think, really reproducing Darwin's original ideas. But he read biological books about the evolution of in the biological domain, and other books of that sort, like by Wilhelm Roh and Rolf Nägeli, and so. But that's all German literature of the time. I think for his psychological view, more interesting is a book that he also read by a French psychologist called Alfred Épinat, which I talked about because he has some kind of direct influence, I think, on Nietzsche's views. That was some more some kind of comparative animal psychologist. That's the way the Hofer himself presents the book, and so I think it's a good example of how Nietzsche read this sort of empirical literature in psychology and biology, or in this case, it's something in between. And how it tries also to inform his views based on those readings. Yeah. So he surely knew a bit of that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. What is it that in the book you call the semiotic claim?
Okay, that's just a label I use for a famous claim that Nietzsche makes in Beyond Good and Evil, according to which, as he writes there, moralities are just the sign language of the effects. So the idea is just that the kind of moral judgment that we make, so the way in which we evaluate things in a moral way, depends on our affective responses. So it's basically a version of sentimentalism, as I understand it, anyway.
Mm-hmm. What is the soul for Nietzsche? I mean, does he have that concept, and what does it mean for him exactly?
Yeah. Okay, first of all, it may be surprising to find that someone like Nietzsche, who always disparages about, I don't know, religion and so on, comes up with the notion of a soul. But, it's important to say that in the 19th century, the notion of soul was still used also, let's say, in psychological context. So it's not necessarily related to this kind of religion worldview that Nietzsche was obviously rejecting. And Nietzsche is clear about that, but he does want to keep the notion of soul, but at the same time to reformulate it, to reconceive it, and he proposes to consider the soul as a social construction of drives and effects, and that's where we have this formulation suggesting that drives and effects are the basic items, let's say, in psychology, according to him. So that's the main redefinition of soul, at least the one I really focus on in my book. But so you can call it a naturalized notion of soul. He is keen to say, well, it's of course we no longer believe it's immortal, so it's a notion of a mortal soul, and so on. So he detaches the notion from the religious and also ancient tradition up to a certain point. And it's what one can see there are some kind of tacit reference to Plato, who also has this kind of view of the soul as composed by different parts, and Nietzsche surely wants to build on that, and also the idea that the soul is also some kind of normative, evaluative entity. So the soul parts in Plato have some sort of, so they are also relevant because they orient our actions, our agency, and in Nietzsche, drives and effects play the same role. So we evaluate things around us because we have drives and effects.
Mm-hmm. For Nietzsche, what is the role of socialization? I mean, how does socialization influence perhaps the way we think, our minds work, our psychology in general?
Yeah. So I think that there are different roles that socialization helps. So I think the first one is that it reshaped the way in which our drives work. So through socialization, certain drives, and particularly the aggressive drives, are in some way or other kept in check, and new drives are developed, or at least new behavioral disposition, and also our affective life is changes accordingly. So first we have then this kind of regulation or reshaping of our of the way in which our drives are configured, so to speak. And second, and that's I never claim that Nietzsche makes, the fact that we are self-conscious beings has to do with socialization. So there's this famous aphorism in gay science where he said, that consciousness has to do with communication, is linguistic in nature. And so I think the way in which we work as self-conscious beings has to do with socialization, communication, depends on the sort of social interactions. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. How did Nietzsche think about consciousness? I mean, what is consciousness for him, and how did it work? Were there different kinds of consciousness? For example, you just mentioned self-consciousness.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's one kind of it or not, so tell us about that.
Yeah. So I think, in fact, the main, when Nietzsche talks about consciousness, he usually means or is typically interested in a certain kind of consciousness, what I call reflective consciousness. It is, which is also a type of self-consciousness, in fact. So it's the capacity to consciously reflect, to consciously think on what we experience and what we do, and so on. And this is the kind of consciousness that is, according to him, dependent on language and on, in an evolutionary perspective from communicative practices, from the so it's something that is that emerged together with language and communicative practices and so on. So with socialization, basically. The question is, is just that what consciousness is, or do we have different kinds of consciousness? So I think, in my view, many of the things that we describe nowadays as part of our conscious life, cannot be covered by that notion of reflective consciousness. And I think so something like phenomenal consciousness, or even the kind of consciousness involved in perception, I don't think they are covered by that notion. And I don't think that Nietzsche would deny, I don't know, that sensations like pains or that perceptual states are unconscious, right? Mm-hmm. For instance, that creature with no language capacities would be strictly unconscious. So I think he allows that there is a different kind of consciousness which is not language dependent. So Schopenhauer basically does the same. So I think there I see some continuity between him and Schopenhauer. So that's the way. So the reason why I distinguish between different notions of consciousness, and I try to say, what Nietzsche may think about these different sorts of consciousness. But the really major interest that he has is in this notion of self-reflective or of reflective self-consciousness.
Mm-hmm. Is there any relationship between consciousness and communication?
So if we focus on this kind of reflective consciousness, yes, because that's the basic claim he makes in this aphorism in the gay science. He says that consciousness is tied evolutionarily and in its very essence, so to speak, with language, in particular with the communicative aspect of language. He said, well, when human beings need to get together to protect themselves from a dangerous environment, then to do that, I mean, they need to communicate. So language was born as a tool, really to communicate, to coordinate actions in this sort of primitive communities. And he has this idea then that the capacity for self-consciousness and also for self-knowledge builds on this. So we first learn to communicate, and then we start to reflect on ourselves, and we start learning to express, our thoughts, our emotion. I think one idea is if we want to coordinate our actions, if we want to cooperate, we need to say to others, what we think, how we feel, and so on. And this then requires this kind of capacity to articulate in language our own mental life. And that's, I think, how Nietzsche sees the relation between the evolution of consciousness and the evolution of communication and language. Mm-hmm. At least that's relatively plain that he says this kind of connection, given what he says in this aphorism in gay science.
Mm-hmm. So focusing perhaps just on the reflective type of consciousness, does it have any sort of causal power over behavior, or is it just epiphenomenal for Nietzsche?
Okay, that's really a controversial issue. So some people believe it is more or less epiphenomenal. Some say it has causal power. So I take some kind of so I'm pretty much in the camp of the epiphenomenalist interpreters, but I also try to specify carefully, what this epiphenomenalism I ascribe to Nietzsche amounts to. It's a qualified and relatively, let's say, narrow scope epiphenomenalism. So my basic claim is that reflective consciousness, according to Nietzsche, doesn't directly contribute to the production of token actions. This allows that it may have, different roles also, causal ones, in, let's say, in different areas of our mental life, but that actions are basically caused by our drives or effects and not directly by episodes of conscious thought, so to speak. So that's my version, let's say, of an epiphenomenalist reading of Nietzsche. So one could say, well, that's so restrictive that it doesn't really, that it's not even worth the name epiphenomenalism. Okay, that's some kind of terminological issue at the end of the day. So I'm not absolutely unmovable when it comes to the label. But I think that the epiphenomenalist label is often used in a way which is not very different from the way in which I use it. So what I mean, many epiphenomenalist claims are in fact relatively restricted too. So they don't really rule out any possible causal role for whatever part of our mental life that is argued to be epiphenomenal. So I try to show that with a couple of examples to justify why I think that the epiphenomenalist label is warranted also in that case. But that's more a conceptual or even terminological issue that's not so relevant. But at the same time, it's a way of showing that it's not that even if the version of epiphenomenalism at stake is restricted, it's not a trivial or just a more or less extremely weak claim. So it's still a strong claim about how our mental life is supposed to work.
Mm-hmm. But what are the roles that Nietzsche attributes to consciousness? Does it talk about specific roles or not?
Yeah, so it's not really something that Nietzsche specifies. So he says explicitly in two late works that there is anything like mental causation, whereby what he means, I think, is conscious mental causation. Right? So this really suggests that he's endorsing some sort of epiphenomenalism. The point is, what he says about this, and in the Hebraism from gay science I mentioned, it starts by saying, well, we have this capacity for self-conscious thought and so on, but it's not clear why we have it, because we can do it. In fact, we and almost all of the time we do what we do, and we think what we think, and we feel what we feel, and so on, without that being conscious in that way, in the reflective sense. So why do we have it at all if it's superfluous? Again, this suggests some kind of uselessness or non-causal efficacy of the relevant sorts of consciousness. Now, what is answered there is that precisely consciousness has to do with communication, with social coordination. It allows us to articulate linguistically what we think and to communicate it to other people. And so it's not really something that we need to act to, let's say, to move our body or something like that, to produce goal-oriented behavior and so on. But it's something that we need to communicate, interact with other people. So I think I make this quick suggestion in the book. It's similar to something that Chris Briff, as a famous psychologist, also says in a recent paper on consciousness. He says, well, we don't really need consciousness for doing many things, including acting and so on, but it's really something that we need for our social life. So it's the function of consciousness should be situated in this kind of social interaction, social coordination. And so that's how I also think that Nietzsche situates the role, let's say, of self-consciousness. So, and he says explicitly that's so evolutionary. We have consciousness because we needed to communicate and so on. So I think it's there that for him we have to look for its role, so to speak. But he is explicit that it's otherwise superfluous. He says we can think, feel, and even act without it. And he also says later explicitly, in the Antichrist and in the Twilight of the Idols, that there is no mental causation. So we find this expression in both. So this statement in both works. Well, he uses the word geistig, and I think what he means with that is conscious mental causation. So that there's no one, no such thing. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And what are thoughts then?
Okay, so the notion of thought, I think in Nietzsche is not really clear. I think he uses that in a way that is not very regimented. But I think we can distinguish on the one hand what we may call self-conscious thought or reflectively conscious thought. They are just episodes of linguistically articulated thought. So they are episodes which we think linguistically. And I think a model for that is, for instance, episodes of inner speech. At least I think that's a model to understand how Nietzsche thinks of linguistically articulated thought. And of course, when we talk to others, it's something similar. They are also episodes of, in a way, or so they are also episodes, let's say, of verbally articulated thought. So that's one notion of thinking, that would be self-conscious thinking. But Nietzsche sometimes uses, thought in a more broad sense. So in a broader sense, a bit like Descartes maybe used the notion of thought as a translating, the Latin cogitatio for whatever sort of cognitive or of mental process going on in our mind, whereby Descartes restricted that to conscious mental states, and Nietzsche doesn't do that. So he allows also for something like unconscious thought, if there is so if Nietzsche then thinks that self-reflective thought is linguistic in shape and nature, he thinks that unconscious thought is not. So it has to be some kind of different, let's say, representational form. But I suggest it is, in many cases, at least pictorial. We can also think of mental states that don't have any kind of representational content at all, like pains and sensation. And maybe Nietzsche sometimes, covers those states too when he talks about thought or thinking. So I think sometimes he uses that just as a very broad term that we could translate with cognition. So everything which belongs to the realm of cognition is covered by what he calls thought. Sometimes he uses in a more he uses the term in a more restricted way, and sometimes just to refer to self-conscious thought. In that case, I think they are those episodes of a linguistically articulated thought, what he is thinking about.
And how does he place thoughts in relation to drives and affects?
Yeah. So if we, so in this case, I think the question is more pertinent when we mean with thoughts self reflective conscious thoughts. I think in that case, in general, so Nietzsche thinks that conscious thought is, as he writes, a tool of the drives. And so basically, I would say when we think or reflect, the way we think or reflect depends on the kind of drive configuration we are in at that moment. So usually so we formulate thoughts that reflect the point of view of a certain drive we have in within ourselves, so to speak. So it's always something. But so basically, we could think of a capacity of self-conscious thinking as some kind of purely rational capacity that manages to be completely detached from our drives, understood as motivational dispositions. But that's not how Nietzsche thinks of it. So he takes self-consciousness or reflective consciousness to be always the upshot of the way in which our drives are structured or ordered at a given moment. So there is no self-consciousness and also no conscious self that is completely detached from the drive. You say when we complain about a drive, it's usually another drive complaining about it. So it's always the perspective of a certain drive that is expressed, let's say, by our thought.
Mm-hmm. But is there such a thing as the self for Nietzsche? And what would that mean exactly?
Yeah, so I think, again, it's useful to distinguish maybe different notions of self. So one could think of the self as some kind of conscious self, completely detached, let's say, from our bodily constitution or something like that. And I think Nietzsche surely denies that there is a conscious self of that sort. What he thinks we have is a conscious, self-conscious point of view or a self-conscious perspective. But, as I already mentioned before, this conscious perspective, conscious point of view is just the upshot of the way in which our drives are configured at the end of the day. So it's not something, it's not a self that exists beyond our drives in some kind of independent entity, so to speak. But Nietzsche also uses the notion of self to describe precisely the order or configuration of the drives constituting us. So there's a famous speech in Zarathustra where he distinguishes between the I and the self. So he uses the German words Ich und Selbst. And, the I would be this self-conscious self, and the self is just, the configuration of our drives. And he says that the I is just the expression of the self, so which combines with what I've said before. So the self is the real self. So the self constituted drive is our real self, so to speak, and or our basic self, and the conscious point of view we have, what we usually take to be our I, though, to stick to the kind of terminology he uses, is just an expression of this basically drive constitute itself. So I use this distinction that Nietzsche himself makes in this speech by Zarathustra, to make sense of his views about the drives. So, and at the end of the day, the beefy notion of self is proposing is the one that he calls Selbst, the one constituted by our drives.
Mm-hmm. But then, I mean, does it correspond in any way to that kind of sense of unified self that we tend to have, or is that simply an illusion for Nietzsche and the self is just this sort of bundle of different drives, for example?
Yeah, so I wouldn't say it's just a bundle of different drives in the sense that, for Nietzsche, drives, they, as he says in this reformulation of the concept of soul, the drives, they form a kind of hierarchical structure. Mm-hmm. And so I would say there is some kind of unity to our self, but it's some kind of functional unity. So it's the functional unity of the drives in the way they are ordered or structured, in the kind of arrangement they have. Of course, there is some kind of unity in the sense of, I don't know, a transcendental unity as in a Kantian picture, or a substantial unity as in a Cartesian picture, where the self is the principle is when we have something like conscious self as a principle of unity, of our experience or something like that. Of course, Kant doesn't understand that as an entity, but as some kind of transcendental function. It's not very easy to understand what he means by that. But anyway, I don't think there isn't anything like that in Nietzsche's picture. So I think of course, he agrees that we have that kind of impression. So we experience ourselves as having this kind of, let's say, unity, which is completely independent from our bodily constitution. But I think he tries to explain it as something that derives from the very way in which our linguistically shaped self-consciousness works, and that kind of unity we sometimes at least seem to have, I think he would say is more or less illusory. So it's just part of the way we experience ourselves, but it doesn't really correspond to the real unity that we have, which is, I think, this sort of functional unity of our soul, understood as the social structure of drives and effects, as he puts it.
Mm-hmm. How does Nietzsche think about self-knowledge? I mean, do we really have access to self-knowledge or accurate self-knowledge through introspection or other means?
So the quick answer is no. So Nietzsche is a hard critic of introspection, let's say, and of introspective self-knowledge, which makes his position somewhat uncommon, let's say, in the history of philosophy. Schwitzgebel wrote a couple of years ago a very nice paper on against naive introspection, and he says, he starts by saying philosophers disagree about basically everything, but they seem all to agree that introspection is a real thing. So it's really some kind of almost infallible, or at least highly reliable kind of source of knowledge about ourselves. So Nietzsche is one of those who disagree with this generally accepted view. And I think this generally accepted view can be seen as a combination of two basic claims. One is that we have some kind of direct access to our mind through introspection. So the idea is, well, okay, I can feel the pain of others people directly, but I can feel pains directly in my case. So I have direct access to my mental life. And the second claim is that, you know, this access is epistemically privileged because it is direct, you know. So I know myself much better than other people can know me, at least when it comes to my mental or psychological life. So, and Nietzsche rejects both views because he first thinks that we don't have this kind of direct apprehension of our mental life. He defends an interpretive picture. So he says, you know, when we try to know ourselves introspectively, what we do is just reflecting upon our mental life, and we do that, you know, by applying a certain psychological picture of the mind, and so we interpret ourselves in the same way in which we interpret other people at the end of the day. So it is an exercise of self-interpretation, and this means, you know, self-interpretation as interpretation in general can go wrong. And Nietzsche thinks it does go wrong in many ways. So one point is that, you know, those psychological framework we adopt to make sense of what others think and how they act and so on, it's usually something that entails a lot of, let's say, mistakes. And so we are misled in interpreting what other people do, and so we are also misled in interpreting what we ourselves do. A major example would be many morally loaded beliefs, you know, that are part of standard psychological frameworks. So that's one reason why I think that this kind of self-interpretive introspective access is not really a very reliable source to understand what we really are. So we are often misled by it. And so it thinks that a better way is often a third personal way. So maybe other people can know me better than I do. So I think Schwitzgebel makes another nice example where he said, well, your wife may know better than you when you're irritating. So you may deny that you're irritated, you know, but she knows better, you know, just looking at your face and how you behave. And a second example, which is closer to what Nietzsche does, is just, you know, pursuing a third personal investigation about human nature. First, based, let's say, on empirical sciences, including, you know, the things like anthropology or the study of human history in its very forms, and also the sort of genealogical investigation that he himself pursues, for instance, in the genealogy of morality. So those are ways of making sense of ourselves that are not based on self-introspection, but they are based on, let's say, a third personal access to what we are. So it's a different kind of exercise of self-knowledge. So I think that he would say it's a mistake to assume that, you know, we are so good at making sense of ourselves. So maybe we have to step out of ourselves to know ourselves better, you know. For instance, stepping out of the moral outlook we just inhabit in a certain tradition to understand better, you know, how that moral look as such has shaped our mind.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, one of the ideas that is perhaps one of the most characteristic of Nietzsche, of course, I think it originally comes from Schopenhauer, but what is the will?
Yeah. Well, Nietzsche, as he may have a fancy metaphysical notion that it comes close to the notion of will in Schopenhauer, which is the will to power. But when but if we just look at the will, is basically whatever part of our psychological constitution that makes us act. So is a psychological faculty that is responsible for producing our actions. Well, Nietzsche, in a certain sense, rejects that there is a will as some kind of psychological faculty or something like that. So we could say he has a reductive view in the sense that he again says that the will is basically constituted by the way in which our drives and affects interact. So I think again, in my view, he is inspired there by certain views by contemporary psychologists. I focus in my book on a French psychologist, Ribot, who was very important and famous back then. And basically, I would, let's say, sum up his views in just two quick claims. First, what really makes us act are, at the end of the day, our drives and effects. So that's again a version of something we saw before. And so if we want to really if we want to identify something that plays the role that traditionally is ascribed to the will, then that's again the structure of our drives and effects. Second, when we talk about the will, we sometimes also mean the kind of volitional phenomenology that we experience when we act intentionally. And Nietzsche says that offers a very I didn't want to say debunking, but so a highly revisionary picture, an analysis of that phenomenology. This phenomenology tells us that, our conscious intention is what usually causes our action, and so on. As long as volitional phenomenology suggests that, Nietzsche thinks is something that is illusory, because what really causes our actions are again our subpersonal drives and effects, and so there is this second part of this theories about the will, or views about the will, some sort of again skepticism, or about the deliverances of volitional phenomenology, which again, I mean, it can be seen as part of its more general skeptical picture about introspective knowledge.
Mm-hmm. Did Nietzsche make any claims about free will? I mean, do we have free will? Do we not? Did he have anything to say about that?
Well, he says, in fact, many things about free will. It's something that I don't really pursue in my book. I didn't have a very clear picture, so I have more of a, let's say, a working hypothesis about what he thinks about the will. So basically, there are two main ways of seeing things. Some say that Nietzsche simply denies that we have anything like free will, and you really find a lot of passages suggesting that, not only in the middle Nietzsche, let's say, in Human All Too Human, but also later, up to The Twilight of the Idols. But at the same time, you have from time to time, let's say, occasion where he seemed to defend or endorse a certain notion, a certain positive notion of free will, or at least of freedom. This is, of course, a bit puzzling, but that's the basis on which others say that Nietzsche doesn't really give up completely on the notion of freedom, but he gives some kind of positive, however revisionary characterization of that notion. So basically, you have let's say interpreters who see Nietzsche as a hard determinist, like Brian Leider, and interpreters who think that Nietzsche is a compatibilist, maybe a revisionary one, highly revisionary one, maybe, who saves freedom, but in a reconceptualized way. So people like, I don't know, there you have quite different ways of spelling out what freedom means. You have, I don't know, people like Ken James or Paul Katsafanos, John Richardson, and so on. So I think that if the notion of freedom that Nietzsche preserves is really highly revisionary, but so my main hypothesis, which is really just an insight, which I don't even know it is an insight at all, but is that Nietzsche's. So what makes his views about free will hard to square is that he seems to think that it's just a mistake to assume that the notion of free will is just a purely descriptive metaphysical notion. So he often takes that notion as a target of his criticism. Let's say the traditional notion of free will, and then he talks about determinism and so on. But I think that his main insight is that when we talk about freedom, the notion we use is not purely descriptive, but always has in itself built in an evaluative standpoint. And I would say that he want to contrast, usages of freedom that have built in an evaluative viewpoint that he rejects with a different notion that does the same. It's not a purely metaphysical descriptive notion, but it's built in it an evaluative viewpoint. That's why I think he usually uses this notion of freedom in a very closer conceptual relation to that of nobility, which is, of course, evaluatively charged. So that's basically my insight. So, and if it's more or less right, I think it helps to explain why it's so difficult to square Nietzsche and to ascribe his view to a compatibilist or hard determinist camp, because those positions assume that the notion of and that the problem of free will is just a purely descriptive metaphysical one. Okay, can we have freedom given that we are in some way determined or not? But I think how Nietzsche puts things suggests that the notion of freedom and also the way he uses it is not purely descriptive metaphysical, but also has a normative dimension to it. So that's as I said, just an idea, and I didn't work it out in the book. Maybe I will do that at some point later. Yeah.
Okay. Is there any space for agency in Nietzsche's psychology?
Yeah, I think there is. I mean, so surely Nietzsche thinks that that we act and he gives a what we may call a theory of action, based on his view of the will, on his drive psychology and so on. Now, one could say, well, is there any space there for some kind of more robust notion of agency, or something, but an agency that we can call maybe autonomous or something like that. Again, I think that's really involves the same kind of problem that we have in saying, so is there something that we can call free agency according to Nietzsche, right? So in that case, the notion of autonomous agency would be, I think, highly revisionary, according to Nietzsche's picture. But I think, so Nietzsche distinguishes between. I think his basic distinction is more different kinds of, let's say, psychological makeups or psychological types, so to speak, and I think some of them display a more successful, so to speak, kind of agency, and I think that has to do at the end of the day with the notion of values, right? So I think what good agency or genuine agency amounts to in Nietzsche's eyes is has to do with evaluation and values. So well, that's maybe something that pops up again in our questions. I don't know.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I mean, Nietzsche talked about a sort of ideal human type. What is this?
Yeah, so that's basically what I was trying to gesture at in the last answer. Yeah. So Nietzsche, of course, is not really that much interested in, or only indirectly so, in, let's say, a descriptive view of the human mind, but is more interested, let's say, in offering a picture of the human being that can serve, his project of revaluation of values, and so he says, well, he sketches what we may call the picture of an ideal human type, which embodies, this ideal of reevaluation of values. So something that contrasts, I don't know, Judeo-Christian morality and so on. And I think so. In the last chapter of the book, I try to say something about that and see how his view of the ideal human type connects to his general views about human psychology. And I think there are certain traits that we can ascribe to this general ideal type. First, it has to display a certain strength of will, which means given Nietzsche's drive psychology, the ideal human type has to display some sort of psychological stability. It has to have a stable drive structure, because otherwise it couldn't really do anything worth pursuing. So that would be just a basic condition on successful agency in general. But I think that that's not sufficient for someone to be an ideal type, as Nietzsche says, just to display this sort of strength of will. And he makes that clear considering the case of the fanatic. So the fanatic also displays a lot of strength. He can really comply, and he can forces himself to do very tough things, in fact. But he says that's not really a case of real strength of will, but not really a case of free will. So it's interesting that there is one of those cases where Nietzsche uses the notion of free will in a positive way. So what's the problem of a fanatic? So one could say, so I think an obvious problem that is something that our scholars like James or Katzenfans already worked out is the idea, that the fanatic is a alienated, divided type, psychological type. He has to repress a lot of his drives, and basically he is not unified. He's an disunified, self-alienated, and so on. And of course, that's a not what Nietzsche imagines as the ideal human being. And so a second condition beyond strength of will would also be this kind of unity or lack of self-alienation that we see in the case of a fanatic. So the fact that he doesn't have to repress or just eradicate certain drives. But Nietzsche seems to think that that's made, so at least Nietzsche sometimes points to a fervor feature of ideal types, which again is something that I think he has in mind when he says that the fanatic doesn't display any free will. Basically, this third feature is the capacity to act according to values that the self has set herself or himself. So not to act. So and I mean that's a notion that we could understand as a version of autonomy. So it means just acting, let's say, on values that you set to yourself, and not acting on values that come, let's say, from outside or something like that. The fanatic, according to Nietzsche, is someone who acts on values that aren't really set by himself or by herself. And that's another problem of the fanatic, I think. So we would have then three features: strength of will, first, being a unified human being, the second one, and being a someone who is able, to set his or her own values and to act upon values set in that way. Why this third feature is so relevant or is really a necessary feature is a bit puzzling. My suggestion is that, that has to do with the kind of situation in which we late moderns, Nietzsche readers, find ourselves in. So his project is that of a revaluation, right? And so that's it. That he saw, his contemporary in the grip of Judeo-Christian morality. So to become an ideal human type, late modern human beings need to first invert, reevaluate things, and that's why I think he puts so much weight on this feature. So we have to be value creators, because otherwise it means that we are accepting those, let's say, nihilistic values of Judeo-Christian morality. But I think this first feature in a different historical age may not be necessary for someone to be a let's say an ideal human agent according to Nietzsche's own views. But I think it's necessary, let's say, for late modern Europeans, who are still in the grip of Judeo-Christian morality. So that's how I see why he insists so much on this capacity, to set your own values, to emancipate yourself, let's say, from received values, to set your own standards, and so on. So I don't think it's just some kind of individualistic viewpoint that he is defending. It has more to do with his project of revaluation and with the historical condition he saw, 19th century Europeans to be stuck with.
Mm-hmm. So, please correct me if I'm perhaps oversimplifying things here a little bit, but when it comes to the capacity to create one's own values, just putting aside what we know nowadays from social, moral, and political psychology, just within the Nietzschean framework, the Nietzschean approach to the human mind and human psychology, Is there really any space, or is it possible for us to sort of overcome or put ourselves outside of our psychological predispositions in the form of drives, affects, or whatever, to really be able to create our own values? Or is that not really what Nietzsche had in mind?
Okay, so what I think that Nietzsche has in mind when he says that he should create new values, so first of all, he really seems to believe that evaluative attitudes are something that in our psychology depends on this deeper configuration of our drive. So basically, to change the way in which we value things, to create new values, means at the end of the day to change the configuration of our drive. So, for instance, okay, that's really an example that is very common, let's say, when we talk about Nietzsche. So he thinks that, I don't know, Judeo-Christian morality has created a certain drive configuration in ourselves. For instance, it has well, it contributes to the repression of aggressive drives, or to a redirection, let's say, of aggressive drives towards ourselves. That ends up in the common feeling of guilt, or at least in a very specific way in which we feel guilty, and so on. So to reevaluate values means, for instance, reshape our drive configuration so that we no longer feel that kind of guilt, that we now feel as product, let's say, of Judeo-Christian morality. So that would be an example. But you really have to. So the place to change things would be this deep level of our human psychology, where drives and affects are involved. So how to do that? So I think Nietzsche writes his works also with this aim. So I think one aim, sort of the Chris Janaway, I think, has put this in a very illuminating way. So, but one of the goal of, for instance, the genealogy of morality is to detach the reader effectively from Judeo-Christian morality by creating some kind of aversive response to it, at least in certain readers. So that it's so acting in this way to our effective constitution, helps at least reshaping a bit what we are psychologically. So I think reevaluation is supposed to work in this way. So just to change our effective reaction and disposition. That is, at the end of the day, our drive and effects configuration. I'm not sure it answers your question.
Yeah, I mean, it's very complicated, I guess, to understand this aspect of Nietzsche's philosophy. But anyway, just two more questions. In what ways do you think that Nietzsche's philosophical psychology differs the most from the approaches by other prominent philosophers?
Okay. Well, it depends, which philosophers. I mean, we compare it to. I think. So first of all.
Okay, so perhaps the most distinct traits.
So I mean, well, some. You could compare it, I don't know, to Kant, more of psychology. I mean, there is where probably the distinction is clearer. So you don't have this kind of let's say transcendental story, about the human mind. At the level, let's say, of theoretical philosophy, and also at the level of practical philosophy. So some would say that what Nietzsche offers is a variation on Hume. on Hume's more psychology. We find in Nietzsche, plausibly at least, a version of sentimentalism, which is what Hume already proposes. And so someone like, for instance, Neil Sinnebaum, argues that basically Nietzschean psychology is a version of human psychology, still an interesting one, because you get certain details or certain claims that don't appear in Hume, but that you find in Nietzsche. So you could, let's say, refine the Humean view of the mind, by plugging in certain Nietzschean insights. So I don't disagree with that. In fact, I think there is a surely strong similarities between Hume and Nietzsche. I think there are also some dissimilarities, but they are more local. So maybe you could almost, without loss, translate, Nietzsche back to Hume or something like that. I think they disagree about certain things, but maybe not so relevant. And of course, I think a major difference is that Hume doesn't really to factor in this difference between conscious and unconscious mind, and that plays a big role in Nietzsche. So that, I think, makes probably the most difference between these two philosophers. So and maybe that's also one reason why it may not be so easy, after all, to really translate back Nietzsche to a purely human view of human psychology. So some could put that also in a relation to Aristotelian, psychology. I think Nietzsche. I think that seems to imply some notion of second nature. And I mean, you could probably read Nietzsche in that way, but I'm not very sympathetic to this kind of reading. So I don't think that for Nietzsche there is anything like a really robust Aristotelian second nature. So maybe you could see there also a difference with Hegel too. We started by talking about naturalism in Nietzsche, and so recently you also have naturalistic readings of Hegel, for instance, by Pinkert. But Pinkert, is very explicit that this sort of naturalism is of Aristotelian, is of the Aristotelian sort. So the idea is that, okay, we acquire some kind of second nature, which is not really completely detached from our first nature, but that is, is a really substantive add-on, so to speak, and that really, in a certain way, also supersedes our first nature. So, at least as I understand it. So to use a Hegelian term, is a Haufhebung of our first nature. So our second nature it preserves something, but it really transforms it also into something quite different. And I don't see that Nietzsche's naturalism works like that. So he wanted to translate the human beings back to nature. So it doesn't seem like a project where you really want to build some kind of new nature on a first nature, but it's really trying to showing that when we thought it would be a second nature is really not a second nature at all, or it's more like an illusion. And to understand really how human being works, we have to go back, seeing them as first nature things. And so there, I think, where a deep difference lies between the kind of naturalism that Nietzsche adopts, and the one that you could find, for instance, in Hegel as at least read, as a naturalist, and also probably in a broader Aristotelian approach to human nature and to also to the human mind. So I think these are usually, the major names that, pop into one's mind when we talk about human psychology or moral psychology.
Right. So, one last question then. Do you think that Nietzsche would approve of contemporary scientific psychology?
So I think it would be happy to have more empirical, informed, let's say, views of the mind, to incorporate in his own views. So he always says, psychology is important to understanding how we work as human beings. He says, psychology should again be the root to the major problems in philosophy and so on. So maybe that's not. So what he means there may not be limited to what we nowadays call psychology, that is empirical psychology, but it surely doesn't rule that out. I think Nietzsche was also keen to point out that some science, and including of course psychology, so empirical psychology, was still driven by moral prejudices, and maybe that is something that he would find again in contemporary psychology too. And there, I think he would again disagree or not like it that much, so to speak. So he would see that certain ways of theorizing about, I don't know, the evolution, for instance, of certain aspects of human psychology may be guided by moral prejudices, as he saw certain moral prejudices also at work in, in late 19th century biologists or social scientists and so on. So that may be a reaction that he would also have to, let's say, the contemporary scientists.
Mm-hmm. So I will be leaving a link to your book in the description box of the interview, Nietzsche's Philosophical Psychology. Would you like to mention any places on the internet where people can find you and your work?
Well, I think the best place is by field papers or field people. This. I guess every philosopher knows that. So I have there. So most of my papers are there, and they are also downloadable there. So if you want to read something more, you'll find there free copies, so to speak. So free versions of those papers. I think it's the best place to find my work in the internet. In particular, if you don't have subscription to journals or. Yeah.
Okay, so Dr. Riccardi, thank you so much again for taking the time to come on the show. It's always a pleasure to talk to you.
Well, thank you again, for this second invitation, and I hope to write another book so we can have a third one. Okay.
Yeah. Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you like what I'm doing, please share it, leave a like, hit the subscription button, all of those things you already know. And please consider supporting the show either on PayPal or Patreon. All of the links will be in the description box of the interview, starting at $1 per month, so it would be a great help. This show is brought to you by Enlights, Learning and Development Done Differently. Check their website at enlights.com. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters: Karen Litske and Blanchett, Pererga Larson, Lau Guerrero, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunder, Ricardo Vladimiro, Greg Healy, Adam Castle, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Wiesel, Jacob Klinkby, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Henrik Alenia, John Connors, Paulina Barron, Philip Force Connolly, Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Rutger Vosbo, Weingard, Rebecca Newberger Goldstein, Dan Demetrio, Robert Windager, Rui Narcio, Arthur Coe, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Susan Pinker, Bernardo Seixas, Pablo Santurbano, Simon Colombo, Jorge Espinha, Phil Kavanagh, Mark Blythe, Roberto Inguanzo, Michael Stormir, Eric Neumann, Samuel Andreev, Tiago Nunes, Bernard Hugni, Alexander Dunbauer, Fergal Cusson, Evan Bodrenko, Al Herzog, Don Ross, Jonathan Librant, Oslam Bullitt, Nathan Nguyen, Stanton T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, J.W., João Eira, Tom Hummel, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Eden Solon, Romain Roach, Dmitry Grigoriev, Diego Antonio Correa, Tom Roth, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavel Ostazewski, Nelek Bach, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, Al Ortiz, Guy Madison, Gary G. Hellman, João Linhares, Lida Cosmidis, Sam Afzal, Adrian Yegi, Nick Golden, Paulo Tolentino, João Barbosa, Jules Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Pons Cortez, Ursula Litske, Denise Cook, Scott Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy and Trader in NYC. My producers Izar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Ian Gilligan, Luís Caetano, Tom Vanagdam, Curtis Dixon, João Linhares, Benedict Mueller, Vega Guidi, Sardus France, Thomas Trumbull, and Nuno Welder. And my executive producers Michel Rugieski, Rosie, James Pratt, Matthew Lavender, Sergio Codreanu, and Bogdan Kanivets. Thank you for all.